Throughout the history of World of Warcraft's 20 plus years, there have been many abilities that have come and gone. Some that are kinda boring, some that don't make sense, and others that just flat out suck. However, in today's list, we're going to be discussing some of the best WoW abilities that cannot be brought back into the modern game. This ultimately boils down to balance and issues, so let's discuss the top offenders of this category. And starting us off at number 10, we have the Skull Banner. Introduced in the Mists of Pandaria expansion, this ability was granted to warriors of all specs. It was automatically given at level 87 and had a 3-minute cooldown. Suffice to say, the cooldown wasn't what made this ability so nice. Essentially what it does is when clicked, it would throw down a banner in a similar way to a shaman placing their totems. Once planted, it would grant all allies within 40 yards a whopping 20% additional critical strike for 10 whole seconds. As an added bonus, warriors could also intervene towards it, making them get a small burst of extra mobility if they knew where it was. But this was incredibly niche for the time. This strength obviously comes from being able to give the entire raid 20% more crits for damage and healing for 10 seconds, which when lined up can be pretty spectacular. It made warriors much more welcomed in hardcore raid environments because they brought one of the strongest external buttons for the time. It wasn't uncommon to see multiple warriors chaining this ability during a raid's burst window to really help melt a boss. Pairing it with things like Bloodlust and just executing an order of warriors to press Skull Banner meant you had a lot more haste and crit on top of it. The only difference is that Skull Banner could be used multiple times in a fight, unlike Bloodlust. Unless you were fighting something like the Shah of Fear for 20 minutes. Unfortunately for warrior players, this button saw its doom in the very next expansion, along with many other classes after the overpowered factors of Mists of Pandaria. For the time, it also wasn't even buffed or nerfed. It just stayed like that for all of Mists because almost every spec was really good. A common expansion we'll hear about when it comes to entries on this list. It wasn't super insane to see something like this for the time. But nowadays, if a warrior could grant their group 20% more crit for 10 seconds, it would be game changing for raids and dungeons to come. It actually almost resurfaced in the Dragonflight expansion, briefly being added into the beta of the expansion before being removed pretty quickly a few builds later. And at number 9, we have Ashen Hollow. So, during the Shadowlands expansion, players were given a choice between 4 different covenants that would grant them a class-specific spell alongside a general one that everyone got. Very oftentimes, the class-specific choice is why people would go to a certain covenant, and for paladins, it was often quite a toss-up between Kyrian or the star of this entry, Venthyr. To sum it up, Ashen Hollow was a generic red circle that paladins could place at a select location, which would persist for 30 seconds on a 4-minute cooldown. You could mess up where you meant to place it, and it was probably fine because your tank could easily just move mobs over into the cast zone for you. Think of it like a consecration, but way better. It would deal very heavy amounts of DPS and healing to anyone and anything that stood in it, while simultaneously allowing paladins to free cast their Hammer of Wrath ability. Now, paladins are a sort of combo generator type class in the fact that they generate combo points with weaker abilities to spend them on much harder hitting abilities. Hammer of Wrath is specifically designed for all paladin specs to be cast during the execute phase of a mob or boss, meaning it does a little bit of both worlds here. Good damage and generates the holy power to spend on better abilities. When you combo this with the high damage throughput of the Ashen Hollow itself, and the ability to essentially press a smaller execute at any percent of HP on a mob, you had paladins going bonkers on bosses and AoE packs alike. The real holy shocker of this combination were holy paladins and not the tank or DPS specs actually. See, when we say the damage Ashen Hollow could provide was a lot, we mean there were MDI runs with holy paladins bursting on dungeon bosses, doing more DPS than not just their tank, but all 3 of their DPS at once for a considerable amount of time. The best part is that they're still doing a ton of healing to your group. They were everything you'd want at once when Ashen Hollow was active. That's not even to say that Protection and Retribution were bad with this ability even. It's just Holy seemed to gain the most value out of this ability than them. And it makes sense too. Adding a button on a 4-minute cooldown means that it just has to be twice as good as a regular 2-minute cooldown. Otherwise, Ashen Hollow would just suck. Even Army of the Dead for Unholy DKs in recent WoW history is generally a 3-minute cooldown, but Ashen Hollow was even longer. It probably was one of the strongest buttons a single class had that wasn't something like an external like Castle Nathra anti-magic zone. It founded some of the highest playtime in Holy Paladins in recent years, and it's a shame to see it gone, at least visually. But it makes sense why it had to stay in the Shadowlands. This thing did way too much, and the only way to really tune it was to lower its cooldown and numbers, but then you take away the fantasy of just being super OP every 4 minutes. At least a future glyph to make Consecration look like Ashen Hollow would be nice in the future. And at number 8, we have Spirit Shell. Back to some Mists of Pandaria buttons. Spirit Shell would be granted a Discipline Priest. When pressed, it would cause your main healing spells to no longer heal, but instead create an absorption shield on your target for 15 seconds. The Spirit Shell aura would last 10 seconds on the priest on a 1-minute cooldown. For the time in MoP, this was greatly useful to prepare for incoming damage variables. When you would become familiar with the fight, you could instead press this button and start healing everyone early, thus stopping the damage from ever really occurring in the first place. Plus, the shields granted could be pretty huge, sometimes nearly your entire health bar. This made living certain mechanics far easier, as being able to straight up prevent the damage is far more valuable than just healing it back off, especially in the modern day, as sometimes you might just get one shot and then there's nothing to heal. Eventually, the ability was removed from the Disc Priest in Legion, but was later reintroduced in the Shadowlands expansion, where Disc had undergone some pretty hefty class changes since MoP. If you're slightly unfamiliar with how Disc Priest works, its main method of healing the group is by dealing damage while applying a buff to their teammates called Atonement. And this is what causes the damage they do to then heal their group. What Spirit Shell would do in Shadowlands is cause your main healing abilities, including Atonement, to become absorb shields on your targets based on 100% of their maximum HP. This would essentially shield groups from damage and double their effective health pools, and make tons of mechanics easier to handle. Blizzard pretty quickly nerfed this to instead convert to an 80% absorb shield based on the healing done by the priest and not the maximum HP of the target, but regardless, it was still quite strong on a 1-minute cooldown. Thus, they nerfed it to a 1.5-minute cooldown instead. It remained this way for the remainder of Shadowlands and was quickly removed again in Dragonflight due to the hassle of trying to balance something that gives you nearly 2 times the amount of health for a large group every 90 seconds. And at number 7, we have Dark Simulacrum. Now, before we get into this, we do understand this ability does still exist in the modern game, but only as a PvP talent for Death Knights. In this entry, we are specifically talking about the usage of this button in PvE settings in the past and why it hasn't been usable in PvE since. Introduced in Cataclysm for all Death Knights, this button would essentially become the spell reflection warriors have, but on steroids. It would cost 20 runic power on a 1-minute cooldown. When pressed, it would essentially curse the target and cause their next spell that costs mana to then be transferred to the DK who cast it, and allow them to cast an exact duplicate of the spell back at them. Now, the craziness of this ability is as it sounds. Like when a Frostbolt was cast on you as a DK, you had applied Dark Simulacrum, you could then gain Frostbolt and use it back on them. This applied for naturally every single class in the game, and a very well-timed placement of, we'll call it DS for short, spelled a very different PvP environment. But this still exists in PvP. So the real kicker for the PvE side of things is the exact duplication portion of the tooltip, which continues to apply when in dungeons and even raid environments. This would allow the Death Knight to have a well-timed DS on a boss and be able to steal their exact ability and then cast it back at them. The only tricky thing is that if Spell Reflect couldn't reflect the spell, you very likely couldn't steal it. A big difference, however, is that Spell Reflection places a buff on the warrior themselves for a very limited time. If the Death Knight times the DS well and captures the ability from the mob, they can then hold onto it for an exact moment that they deemed necessary to use. Even in Mists of Pandaria, the spell was high to then include all spells in the game. So a DK could just become anything or anyone for a very small moment if they played decently. In Modern Mythic Plus, something this unique could be very route defining if it allowed the group to possibly skip packs, kill them quicker, or be able to play safer because of some sort of CC gain. The possibilities are quite limitless. DKs already are a popular dungeon class amongst the WoW community for their insanely high AoE profiles, so to also provide them with a button that steals abilities would be intense. But then again, people have been asking for a raid DK buff. And at number 6, we have Alter Time, specifically its earliest iteration in Mists of Pandaria. Granted to mages of all specs at level 87, this ability would essentially allow the mage to transport themselves back in time after a brief period of pressing it. It had a 3-minute cooldown, and while in modern WoW it is mostly used as a defensive tool, during MoB it was very crucial to rotate it correctly for your burst window as a mage. If you're unfamiliar with the current version of Alter Time, it basically lets a mage place an invisible copy of themselves wherever they cast the ability. This invisible copy of you would save the health you were at when initially pressed, so if you press Alter Time again, or 6 seconds had elapsed, you would not only return to the spot you had pressed it at, but you would also return to your previous health value. This is how it's primarily used as a defensive tool, as you could save your health in one location, take a bit of damage you may have expected, and immediately regain it by essentially warping time backwards for yourself. However, the first version of this ability didn't only freeze your health, it also froze your mana, buffs, and debuffs. This means that a mage could snapshot the high point of the burst windows, including something like a time warp, and continue a larger window of damage before things began to fall off. The very specific inclusion of allowing your buffs to be saved created a playstyle for mages where if very specific procs occurred during a burst window, or just in general, they could save that buff for another 6 seconds at the cost of a 3-minute cooldown. Let's not forget, it still gives your health back as well. So it still retains the usefulness it has in retail, but with the addition of basically saving your cooldowns. In Warlords of Draenor, the talent was then reworked to work kind of how it does today, going through some buffs since then, like reducing its cooldown and so on and so on. But no class really ever had an ability quite like this, especially when you consider mages are already quite bursty in terms of damage. So this just amplifies their DPS much more. But like many specs in Mists of Pandaria, everyone was overpowered, so everything was definitely balanced as well. And at number 5, we have our first monk ability, Dematerialize. Introduced with the brand new monk class of Mists of Pandaria, this ability comes more as a passive effect for monks rather than a button you actually press. The only caveat to this is that it requires you to be in Serpent Stance, a stance only available to the healer spec of monks, Mistweaver. What this does is, when you are stunned by any source ever, so long as it's considered a stun and not something like a fear, the Mistweaver will then essentially become immune to all melee, range, and spell attacks for 2.5 seconds. Generally, a stun can last just as long as these 2.5 seconds unless it's a full kidney shot from a rogue, just for example. That means almost any time a Mistweaver is stunned, they're actually completely safe from danger and don't run the risk of losing too much health, or even having to commit resources to themselves shortly after the stun ends to stay alive. Once this happens, the Mistweaver then incurs a 10-second cooldown on Dematerialize, but that doesn't actually stop this ability from being good. See, most abilities that stun in WoW have a much longer cooldown than just 10 seconds, meaning that by the time you try again, the monk will be ready for it and not actually have to do anything to beat the stun setup. This is mostly an issue in PvP for people that played against Mistweavers, and it made setups to a kill target in arenas, or killing the monks specifically, much harder because they would basically be immune for at least half of their stun or longer. You could of course chain stun the monk, but this naturally incurs a DR, meaning that eventually the stun gets shorter and eventually does nothing at all if done too quickly. Now admittedly, a version of this passive does persist in the game, but as much more of a nerfed version of its former self as a PvP talent under the same name. This version of the ability instead reduces damage taken by 30% instead of straight immunity, and its DR reduces by 10% each second that you're stunned. So even a 4-second stun would return the damage taken to normal by the final second. It's still good, obviously, but there's a very good reason it doesn't just let you do what it used to. PvP balancing aside, this passive was still very strong in PvE as well. Any sort of encounter or mob that could stun the Mistweaver had the same effect, and aided them in defensiveness very greatly, which is what landed in the middle of our list. And at number 4, we have Smoke Bomb. Introduced to rogues in Cataclysm, this ability does exactly what it sounds like. When pressed, the rogue would drop a cloud of smoke at its feet for 5 seconds, smothering them from enemies outside its radius. This made the rogue themselves and allies unable to be targeted by any enemies outside the cloud, forcing either an enemy player or an NPC to have to move into the cloud if they wish to attack. This of course created very dynamic playstyles, which allowed a rogue to actually support their team in a way to kite mobs or prevent enemy spellcasters from attacking their healer in an arena match, for example. If a warlock was charging up a heavy chaos bolt, the rogue could then use Smoke Bomb to not only waste the time spent casting the chaos bolt, but to make them have to fight inside the smoke, towards the rogue, if they wanted to get the cast off. Very likely the warlock in question would just back off and wait for another opportunity, but this would buy the healer the time necessary to heal up safely. This also applies in a similar way to tanks in dungeons. A tank could need to kite a pack and get into a certain location and force casters to move in closer to attack the tank or others because the smoke bomb doesn't allow them to hit targets inside, allowing for much more efficient AoE cleave. The crazy thing, however, is that Blizzard seemed to think this ability wasn't good enough for rogues. So come Mist of Pandaria, they buffed this ability to just give a flat 20% damage reduction to all players within the smoke bomb. Just to highlight that, can you imagine how many rogues would be desired in modern day Mythic raid settings if you could just suddenly take a 20% less damage for a 10-second ability onto a boss? A rogue wouldn't even need a Trophic Poison anymore probably to get their raid spot. Even in its semi-nerf state in World of Draenor at 10%, this ability was still very strong. So with its unique supporting characteristics established and a 20% damage reduction, there was a lot of power to be had in this button. The only thing comparable to something like this was the older version of Anti-Magic Zone, specifically around Castle Nathria. But even then, it was only spell damage. With Smoke Bomb, it was all damage types, including melee swings on someone like a tank. This talent does also still exist, sorta, but strictly as a PvP talent for all rogue specs. It no longer has the 20% damage reduction, and you'd think only a 5-second long external button wouldn't be so good. But there are many instances of damage that are less than 5 seconds in modern WoW, so it could be just enough to get you through a threshold when necessary, which is what lands it at number 4. And at number 3, we have the Dragonflight 10.2 talent, Illuminated Sigils. This is a very recent occurrence in WoW history, and had only served a very brief period of time during the Dragonflight expansion. When it comes to things like tank balance, you'll typically see them all relatively close to one another in terms of balancing. The determining factors usually come down to things like their DPS, how tanky they are, and obviously how fun they can be. There's always going to be a meta pick for players when pushing the hardest content possible, but typically this meta pick is only a bit ahead of the others. This isn't always the case, however, as the greatest offender of this is the Vengeance Demon Hunter during Seasons 3 and 4 of Dragonflight. To be honest, a partial point in what made this talent so good was also attributed to their tier sets at the time, but more on that later, as it's not the truly meta-defining part. If you're not super familiar with Vengeance Demon Hunters, they can operate a group of abilities called Sigils that they can place on the ground. Sigil of Chains group mobs at the placement of the sigil, Flame to DPS, Misery feared them, Silence with Silence, and Elysian Decree, now Sigil of Spite, would spawn soul fragments, a primary source of sustain for the Demon Hunter. This is, of course, if the mobs in question are hit by the sigils, but this was never a difficult thing to do. Now, the talent Illuminated Sigils doubles the amount of sigils the Demon Hunter has. This means that you are now twice as effective at grouping, kicking, fearing, and DPSing than before, essentially. This was insane for Mythic Plus at the time, and made Demon Hunters such a desired tank because, at the time of the Mythic Plus design, having multiple stops for a pack was very essential in surviving pools. With the inclusion of this talent, a good Demon Hunter could effectively handle all the necessary stops themselves, while the DPS just get to slam as much damage as they can. Of course, every spec has some sort of stop to aid in this system, but Demon Hunters just happen to have the most out of any of them. So much in fact that none of the other takes were even remotely close, unfortunately for them. In a meta where missing crucial interrupts can spell certain death for yourself or the entire group, it was a pretty mindless choice for tank players to start gravitating towards Vengeance to carry their groups to certain victory. It allowed pools that were just straight up not possible with another tank to exist, and just the presence of having one was enough typically for high key pushers. If you go to Raider.io, to this day, you will see Demon Hunters everywhere for the corresponding season. Additionally, their tier set for the time caused their Sigil of Flame to deal extra damage, and just generally make them even tankier. So, not only are they super good for a pretty specific meta, their tier set directly aided in this playstyle, and made them generally unkillable, and sometimes do more DPS than the DPS players themselves. Just to show how good these sigils are though, this talent was removed from Vengeance at the start of the War Within, meaning their effectiveness was cut in half. You'd think that that would spell the end for them, but even now Demon Hunter is extremely competitive, if not the best tank for Mythic Plus, due to still having so many sigils to choose from. So that means even without twice as many of the sigils, the other tank specs struggle to keep up in a similar capacity. It's what caused Blizzard to design dungeons in recent seasons to add many more dungeon mobs that require stops of some sort, in some sort of arms race for trying to still challenge the player without having to just nerf something even further. Nowadays, the talent simply gives Sigil of Flame a second charge and a 5-second cooldown reduction, but it's still the more optimally chosen talent for Vengeance players. Just the very dungeon-defining version it once was can't return to WoW, as tanks all around suffered from this talent, as Blizzard attempted to then buff other tanks to sort of match what Vengeance could do in other ways. An example of this was Blood Death Knights getting Gorfrien's Grass easier to talent into, but with its high cooldown and sort of gimmicky usage, it's still rare to see amongst Blood players. Hence the arms race in question, which is why it's here at number 3. And at number 2, we have Surrender to Madness. For the uninitiated, Shadow Priest was reworked during the Legion expansion to play around a new resource called Insanity. A group of spells would be used to generate Insanity for the priest, and then spent upon reaching maximum Insanity. At the same time, you'd be granted a new ability that essentially replaced their infamous Shadow form called Void Form. Think of it like Shadow Form, but on limited steroids. But also they still had Shadow Form too. You're given stronger abilities and damage at the cost of Void Form being extremely limited. And if you ran out of Insanity, you would revert back to Shadow Form. Void Form would be constantly taken away in duration and progressively get harder and harder to continue generating Insanity to stay in it, eventually taking down on its own no matter what you did to try to stay in. And the longer you stayed in the form, the more your damage got bigger and bigger. However, with the introduction of Surrender to Madness, this would cause all of your Insanity generating abilities to then give you 200% more Insanity instead of the usual amount. You can also cast while moving. So even if you move out of mechanics, your DPS would never slow down. It sounds very strong on its own. So Blizzard's idea to balance this was that if you were to ever exit Void Form after pressing Surrender to Madness, which essentially means losing all of your sanity, you would just instantly die. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. You would just fall over. It had an insanely long 10-minute cooldown, so it seems Blizzard intended this to be sort of a last resort or execute phase with Bloodlust type of talent for Shadow Priest. The only issue is that 200% more insanity, while never having to worry about stopping to cast, made Shadow Priest very able to sustain their Void Form. This means they were just permanently doing 20% more damage, gaining cooldown reduction on Mind Blast, and stacking up more and more haste with every cast of the reduced Mind Blast. Pair this with the Mother Shahraza's Seduction and Magaza's Madness legendaries, and you wouldn't even need to be super good at Shadow Priest to really capitalize on the infinite Void Form. Obviously, Blizzard couldn't let this damage disparity continue, as none of the other DPS specs could compete. So, in 7.1.5, it was changed to be 100% more insanity instead, having its greatness. This still proved very strong. So, in BFA, the ability was reworked altogether, because the playstyle was still very liked by Shadow Priests, and they just kind of wanted to tone it down. This version no longer killed the player, but instead reduced their health by 90%, and prevented the generation of insanity for 15 seconds, and reduced the cooldown to 1 minute, at least by patch 8.1. Suffice to say, this version of the ability wasn't nearly as popular, and wasn't even taken, because the talent Legacy of the Void proved to be far stronger. Finally, in Shadowlands, Blizzard made Surrender to Madness instead only last 30 seconds flat out, essentially granting 30 more seconds of Void Form. But now if the target you cast Surrender on does not die within those 30 seconds, you also die. So they finally seem to have leaned into the Execute style version of the ability, but couldn't quite make it any better, unfortunately. Eventually, it was removed altogether in Dragonflight. This is one of those abilities that's insanely cool in terms of class fantasy and fun to play when done right. It's a shame to see it removed, but it's kind of like the don't be sad it's over, be glad it happened. A main reason for this was because it absolutely made Shadow Priest a very strong, borderline unbalanceable spec. But by removing it, it made Shadow very less competitive with the other DPS, which is pretty rough to have happened to anyone really. So here we are at number 2. And capping us off is Symbiosis at number 1. We all probably knew this was going to be here, but it'd be impossible to make a list like this without having it at the top, or at least mentioning it. Symbiosis, introduced to Mist of Pandaria, allowed a druid player to link themselves with a targeted ally of their choosing. Depending on the spec you may have been when casting this, would then vary what would return to you. What that means is, if you were playing a balanced druid and gave Symbiosis to a DK, you would receive Anti-Magic Shell. In return, the DK would gain Wild Mushroom Plague from you. Not nearly as strong as AMS, but still a nice tool to have. This sort of companionship would continue on for every single spec in the game who bonded with a druid. As you can imagine, this was very difficult to balance, as now every individual version of a copied spell may need some tuning and adjustments because it makes the druid too strong. Really, giving any class another person's abilities makes them too strong. Hence the Dark Simulacrum entry from earlier on. but now this is on a whole other level. It also made the survivability of certain classes extremely high, or even in some cases completely changed raid encounters. You could be a Shadow Priest player and bond with a Druid and be given Tranquility, literally one of the strongest healing spells in the game. Now, of course, every version of this spell was specifically modified to play around with how the class already does this, which created even more balancing issues. The list of abilities granted or gained through Symbiosis was just massive, and actually kind of confusing to an extent. Back in the day, there was a bit less resources to track what buffs you gained or gave to players with this ability, so for a lot of people, you probably just spent some time casting it on different people in your raid to see what would happen during progression. If it existed nowadays, there would surely be some sort of weak ore or add-on that helped tell you, but regardless, this was part of the reason Symbiosis was removed in the following expansion. It would change entire fight dynamics if a Druid could gain Divine Shield or Ice Block suddenly, or provide additional Stampeding Shouts or Bark Skins, making an already desired class stacked to a much higher amount in hardcore raid environments. This also, of course, made PvP very difficult against Druids. As for the memory issue mentioned previously, you would now need to know that a Disc Priest could Cyclone you, or that a Druid might just Spell Reflect you. It was definitely fun for Druids in question, but if you ever found yourself on the receiving end, you'd likely end up more annoyed than glad.